But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. Bethlehem was a very surprising place for Jesus to come from. As that verse says, it was a small place amongst the clans of Judah. As this ancient map shows, Bethlehem was a little village about 5 miles outside Jerusalem. It wasn't a place you went to, it was a place you went through. And both of today's readings and the Magnificat that we read together talk about hope coming from the margins, from small, overlooked and unexpected places and people. Bethlehem crops up a few times as we look through the Bible. It's where Rachel was buried. It's where Ruth and Boaz hung out, where they got to know each other and got married. It's where King David looked after sheep on a hillside before he was called to become king. But of course, it's Jerusalem, not Bethlehem, that was known as the city of David. And then, of course, as we hear in Matthew and Luke's Gospel, it was Bethlehem, as Micah had predicted so many hundred years beforehand, that became the place where the Saviour was born. King Herod was astonished when he was told by the wise men that the star was leading them to Bethlehem. It was not where you expected a new king to come from. Hope came from the margins, not from where it was expected. Last week, we heard about John the Baptist. Oh, sorry, we jumped ahead. Ooh. There we go. Sorry, the order of slides seems to have changed on here. There we go. Hope came from the margins, not from where it was expected. This is a map of the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus. And all of that sort of bluey coloured or greeny coloured, whichever way you see it, land there, the sort of grey coloured land, was the Roman Empire. And the centre of the Roman Empire was, of course, Italy. It was Rome itself. And the cultural and intellectual centre was Athens, was Greece. Palestine, Israel, was a little corner, unimportant, overlooked, pretty forgotten. It's not where you expected something important to happen. And yet that's where Jesus came from. And last week, we heard about John the Baptist. John the Baptist, who lived in the margins, out in the wilderness, who took himself away from the centre, away from the obvious places to preach a message and get a crowd. And yet people recognized that they had to go to the margins to hear his important message. And then in our gospel reading today, we have that wonderful encounter between two pregnant women, between Elizabeth, the older woman, and Mary, a teenager. Elizabeth, who would have been seen as on the margins, not just because she was a woman, but because she had been married for many years without children. She was seen as barren, and that was seen as cursed by God, as overlooked. And yet here she is, chosen by God. And Mary, shockingly, an unmarried teenage mother-to-be. And yet that's whom God chose to bear his son. Hope coming from the margins, from the overlooked, from the edges. And it's not just in the Christmas story, and it's not just in the Bible, that hope comes from the margins. If you look at the history of Christianity here in the UK, its centres of revival and renewal, and where the gospel has been preached and has transformed this nation, have been places on the margins. The early Celtic missionaries went to far-flung islands like Iona off the coast of Scotland, like Lindisfarne, Holy Island, off the coast of Northumberland. The Celtic fringes, St David's in Wales, although it's not mentioned on the map, a number of the Celtic saints were in Cornwall, down in the southwest as well. It was from the margins that the transformation of this country towards Christ began. It wasn't from London, it wasn't from York, it wasn't from Canterbury, it wasn't from the expected places that the transformation came. So today, as we look at a world in desperate need of hope, whether we're thinking about COVID-19, whether we're thinking about climate change, whether we're thinking about political chaos, about a lack of leadership in our world today, can we look to the margins to find hope? As I was thinking and preparing for this sermon, I was thinking about people who've inspired me personally, who are people from the margins. And some of these you might think are a bit predictable for those of you who know me. But I'm just going to talk very briefly about these 5 characters, and some of them you know already. A young Swedish teenager on the autistic spectrum, not somebody you would expect to become one of the most significant voices in our world today. And now yet, when Greta Thunberg speaks, prime ministers and presidents quake because they know she speaks with authority. She speaks and people listen. Parliaments and popes meet with her. When she speaks, people listen. Somehow she has captured and tuned into something that many people find uncomfortable, but know we need to hear. Or what about Malala Yousafzai, who started writing a blog about the need for girls to be educated in Afghanistan and Pakistan and some of those Muslim countries across Asia, who was very nearly killed for her pains, and yet now who has continued to write and to advocate for the needs of women and girls to be educated. Probably not all of you recognize that third woman there at the top. Some of you may. She was on television a little bit back during the COP26 climate conference 2 or 3 weeks ago. Her name is Mia Mottley, or Maya Mottley. She's the Prime Minister of Barbados. And she gave what I found one of the most moving speeches in Glasgow. Standing there in front of the presidents and prime ministers of the world, in front of Prince Charles and David Attenborough. And she spoke up on behalf of small island nations. She talked about how if we carried on as we are, it would be a death sentence for island and coastal communities. She said, we do not want that dreaded death sentence, and we have come here today to say to you, try harder. Failure to provide enough funding to small island nations on the front lines of climate change is measured in lives and livelihoods. It is immoral, it is unjust. Are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity? If our existence is to mean anything, we must act in the interest of all our people who are dependent on us. If we don't, we will allow the path of greed and selfishness to sow the seeds of our common destruction. Powerful and I think prophetic words. When I use that term prophetic, it's interesting how in the Bible and today, prophets often come from the margins, from the sidelines, not people at the centre, but people who are a bit awkward and who have got an awkward message, but one that we need to hear. And then the two older men there at the bottom, because people on the margins don't have to be young, they don't have to be old either. The one on the bottom right there is somebody who I've had the privilege of getting to know and who I now call a friend. His name is Brother Sam. He's a Franciscan monk who has lived a life of intentional simplicity and who has helped the Franciscan Anglican movement here in the UK to adjust to the threats of climate change and to become a challenging and prophetic voice. Somebody who I often turn to for wisdom and advice, who has the flame of faith right at the heart of a very practical and engaged life, as he now lives in the East End of London, in a very multi-faith community, and yet witnessing for Jesus there. The final character there, the bottom left, is an 87-year-old American called Wendell Berry. Somebody who was a very influential figure, speaking on television, with posts at universities, and yet chose to go back and live on a small family farm and to just write, because he felt that that's what he needed to do. And I want to read a brief poem of his, which I hope you will find, as I do, encouraging and even comforting at this time. It's called The Peace of Wild Things. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the woodrow rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and am free. So this Christmas, amidst all the busyness, amidst all the glitz and the glamour and the famous faces on television and in our newspapers, amidst the New Year honours for the powerful and the rich, let us look for hope from the margins, hope from those who are often forgotten and overlooked, who are sometimes victimized, and who are often marginalized. Because in God's kingdom, those who are on the margins, as Mary reminds us in the Magnificat, are those whom God has chosen, whom God values, who are welcomed to the center, and who are raised up to speak God's message to us.